Hi everybody. So today I'm going to be doing a deep dive on Dune, and if you don't know what that is, you've probably been living under a rock for the last few years, but it's okay. I too live under a lot of rocks. So a general outline for this video, I'm going to be breaking it into three parts. First, we're going to talk about the book, the author, the series, that kind of stuff, my personal reading experience, that kind of thing. Heads up here, I do need to talk about some plot points, so minor spoilers. Anyways, second, I'm going to talk about the movies that have been attempted, successes, failures, comparing it to the book. I'll talk mostly about the most recent adaptation. This story has been deemed by critics impossible to put on screen, so there's a lot to break down. And third, I'm going to talk about all of the themes, allegory, politics, environmentalism, why Dune is so important today still. So, to start off, Dune is a 1965 sci-fi novel written by Frank Herbert. In addition to Dune and its 5 sequels, Frank Herbert worked as a newspaper journalist, book reviewer, an ecologist. He did a lot. He had quite the resume. He was in his mid-40s when this book was published, and he passed away at the age of 65, right after the 6th book was published. I believe it was the final one. Dune has been called the greatest sci-fi novel of all time. I don't have a source for that. Great journalist, I know. But enough people have said it that it's pretty easy to believe. You can think of this as the Lord of the Rings of sci-fi. It kind of had the same influence on the genre that Lord of the Rings did for fantasy. So Dune does have 5 sequels. As you can see here, they were published about 3, 4, 5 years in between each one. Here's some more numbers for you. As you can see, the first book, Dune, is significantly longer by word count than many of the others. It definitely works as a standalone. You don't need to carry on with the series. You finish Dune feeling pretty satisfied, but there are some loose strands hanging so that the author could carry on. Also important to know, after Frank Herbert passed, after finishing Chapter House Dune, his son carried on the series, franchise I guess we can call it, because the story was done supposedly. I don't know too much about those other books other than they supposedly weren't too well received. But as a journalist, it's important to know that when people in present day are talking about Dune, they're likely just talking about this first book and the most recent film. So my edition is just under 800 pages with about 100 pages of stuff at the end. So there's notes, a glossary, index, some maps, all that fun stuff. And that's exactly why Dune is often critiqued as being dense and difficult to read. You're very much just dropped into this world in the first chapter and told, hey, here's a glossary, figure it out as you go. So for reference, these are all of the people with weird names, terms with weird names, weird place names that you get and you should know from the first chapter. I'm gonna let that sink in. Fun fact, this book is pretty popular on TikTok. There's a challenge going around where people try to read it in one day. I think it's about 20 hours on audiobook, so it's doable, but I think it's a terrible idea. Most of those videos ended with people in tears. Now that you've been intimidated like I have, what is Dune actually about? Let's get into the plot. So, we're set in a world where various noble houses are controlling planets and their resources. Our main character is 15-year-old Paul. He and his family, the Atreides family, have just accepted the insanely challenging task of moving to and controlling the desert planet Arrakis, aka Dune. Dune is very important because while it is near Dune is pretty important because while it is near Dune is a desert planet, so it is Dune is a desert planet, so it is nearly inhospitable. Got it. It is the only planet where you can find spice. Spice is a drug that extends life and enhances mental abilities. It also assists in space travel, stuff like that. So it's pretty important to be the family coming to control this planet. Meanwhile, Paul is no normal boy because his mother is part of the Bene Gesserit, probably pronouncing that wrong. But anyways, the Bene Gs are a group of women who have been training mentally and physically for generations so that they can one day give birth to a boy with extreme mental superpowers. Just gonna jump in here and add that what sets Dune apart from fantasy and makes it sci-fi is that there are a lot of biological and psychological explanations for why stuff happens. So the Bene Gesserit have been training themselves for generations so that one day their gene pool will be strong enough that it can contribute to what makes the chosen one so strong. They call this I'm not going to try and pronounce it, this one. Paul is this one. And if that wasn't super clear, the Bene Gesserit are only women. They only keep their female babies just to keep this tradition going. So it's a pretty big deal that Paul's mom, the Lady Jessica, was confident enough to keep Paul because she really felt like this was the one. Meanwhile, their rival family, the Harkonnens, are the villains of the story, as you will. They're trying to eliminate the spice drug and have it be blamed on the Atreides family just to destroy their reputation. That's pretty much all I can tell you about the plot without making you lose your mind. Here's a little bit more about the story from my personal experience. I didn't know a lot of that going in. I tried to go in as blindly as I could just to, maximize my reading experience. And I actually really liked this book a lot more than I expected to. I had just finished reading Lord of the Rings recently, and just the writing was... This I liked a lot more. Perhaps one of the reasons why I really liked it is that it's written in third person omniscient. So for example, there is a dinner party. It's like a 30-page long chapter, and you kind of go around the table getting everyone's thoughts. So there's some really interesting intrigue and suspense that comes from that, because you as the reader know what everyone's thinking and you know what everyone's plotting. There really isn't a viewpoint character for every chapter. It's just whoever the author feels like telling you about. So that leads me into the epigraphs. If you don't know what an epigraph is, it's like a little quotes, blurb, passage from other works that the author will put in beginning of a part, beginning of a chapter, just to kind of like tell you the themes or like foreshadow something. So in Dune, there's a little blurb at the beginning of each chapter from the perspective of Princess Irulan. She doesn't come in until the very end. So you're kind of just wondering, like, who is she? Why does she know so much about Paul after the story? But it's just kind of there to foreshadow and keep you reading. But at the same time, the author straight up tells you a lot of like the plot twists before they happen. I read a lot of modern day like epic fantasy where authors really try to reveal stuff and have plot twists like hit. There was none of that in Dune because the author would straight up tell you when something was going to happen before it happens. So for example, we know that as the reader, there is a traitor from the Harkonnen family who has infiltrated the Atreides home. The family is kind of like, is it our doctor? Is it our scientist? Is it one of our political allies? You as the reader know it's the doctor. Like, he straight up tells you in the epigraph before it happens. So there's some very interesting suspense that happens because you as the reader are just waiting to see how the main characters are going to find out about the double agent. Keep that in mind for discussion questions later. Last thing I'm going to mention about the book is that it is told in 3 parts. Shocking, I know. The first part is when all of this like politicking happens, and second part, Paul escapes into the desert. He kind of joins this tribe of people called the Fremen. There's a girl there who he had dreams of. And in the third part, there's a very weird 2-year time jump. I am going to be critical of this time jump though, because it feels really out of place. Paul goes through an insane amount of character development to get to part 3 and to do everything that happens, and you don't get to see any of his growth because of the time jump. Everything kind of comes together in a really interesting and quick way. Without further ado though, let's move on to the movies. So why could this 1965 book possibly be popular right now? Them. So the most recent adaptation for Dune came out in November 2021. This was directed by Denis Villeneuve, this guy, that name, and it is going to be 2 parts. The second movie is set to come out in 2023, same director, same actors, you get it. So the story here does follow the book pretty well. Timothée Chalamet, who plays Paul, does a pretty good job of the fear and the unknown of being that like chosen prophesied one. You know, there's a lot of mystery there. He's still kind of like growing into his own. This particular movie is visually stunning. You could see that there was a lot of money going into the production, the costuming, the music, all the big battles, the action. Like, it was very well put together. So I mentioned before that the author didn't really leave you many reveals. He was kind of telling you, this is going to happen. There's going to be a betrayal. So-and-so is the betrayer. Get ready. In the movie, you don't get that. So there's arguably a very different experience here for first-time viewers, because when you read the book, you're told who the traitor is going to be, but when you watch the movie for the first time, you have to figure that out yourself. So it's like completely different use of suspense and intrigue, because you're thinking about different things from book to movie, but you're still getting the same story. And you could definitely see that they directed and worked that into being a big plot twist, because they could. So keep that storytelling kind of vibe in mind for the discussion questions after. Now that I'm almost done talking about the movie, I should probably mention Zendaya. So Zendaya plays Cheney, who is the girl that Paul is dreaming about throughout the movie. But there was a bit of like controversy, if you will, because she's only in it for like 5 or 6 minutes at the end of the movie. Like, I've had more screen time in this video than Zendaya did in the entire 2-hour, 35-minute movie. Some people were obviously really upset by this because you've got like billboards and posters and trailers that are really kind of showing, hey, Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya are going to be lovers in this movie. And then you don't really get it. In fact, you don't really get Zendaya at all. So people were kind of pissed. But if you've read the book, I actually dog-eared the page. 458 is when Zendaya comes in, and then the movie cuts off like here. Because then this is going to be part 2. So you shouldn't be surprised. You shouldn't be surprised knowing that there is like another movie coming with the rest of the story. But one of the big critiques for Dune was that it kind of felt like a prologue to people. They said there was a lot of setup and not a huge amount of payoff. So again, like part 1 of 2, you should expect that. But some people were left a little unsatisfied, especially Zendaya fans. But I mean, she's so busy. Anyways, it's interesting to discuss the advertising there because a lot of Dune's audience is people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who grew up with these books. So having Timothée and Zendaya, like, you know, really kind of drew some younger people, like people in their teens and 20s, to the theaters, and definitely got that age bracket into reading the book as well. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the immense inspiration that Dune had on the sci-fi genre. Same with fantasy too, actually. So like, for example, we've got Tatooine in Star Wars, which was heavily influenced by Arrakis, the Aiel people in The Wheel of Time, who are almost carbon copies of the Fremen on Arrakis, as well as a lot of the politicking that happens in Game of Thrones was very heavily inspired by the politicking that happens with the Harkonnens and Atreides families. I can't believe I forgot to record this part, but Dune is very much an allegory for the intersection between the environment and politics. So, for example, spice, the drug on Arrakis that is so rare and so important, is very much symbolic of what it's like for politicians to control oil and water on Earth. So Frank Herbert kind of wanted to explore what it's like for politicians at war to be in charge of something so important. And that's kind of why Dune was so big then, but it's kind of like why Dune is so popular now still. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Dune is that in the sci-fi genre, you usually get a lot of like spaceships and technology and stuff like that. And Frank Herbert deliberately like tried to suppress that. And you can kind of see that he focused on the social and political parts of living in a sci-fi world versus flying around in a sci-fi world. Very last thing I'm going to point out is something that Brian Herbert mentions in the afterword. And that is that Dune is a story that can be read over and over and over again from a different perspective. So you can read this from a religious standpoint, focus on one thing, read this from an environmental standpoint and think about how it like is influenced by our own world. You can read this from a political standpoint and get how it's influenced our own world in a different way. You can just read this as a work of fiction and appreciate it for like the masterpiece that it is. That's pretty much it. So thank you, and let's discuss.